please keep in mind that the views expressed by our speakers do not necessarily represent those of the Areopagus or our host church, but they probably will, especially this evening, it probably will. All right. So, a brief introduction here. Rod Dreher was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he graduated from LSU with a BA in journalism in 1989. In 1997, he married Julie Harris Dreher, and they have 3 children. Now, over the years, Mr. Dreher has written about religion, politics, film, and culture in publications like National Review, The Weekly Standard, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He's also been a film critic, writing for the New York Post and other publications, and he's also appeared on NPR, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, if anybody's ever heard of that. For several years, he was an editorial writer and columnist for the Dallas Morning News and the publications director for the John Templeton Foundation. Now, presently, he is the senior editor and blogger at the American Conservative. He's the author of several books, including, of course, the recently published Benedict Option. And also, a book that you might want to take note of is a book that he published in 2006 entitled Crunchy Cons: How Birkenstocked Burkeans, Gun-Loving Organic Gardeners, Evangelical Free-Range Farmers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-Wing Nature Lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America. And so that's it. That's all there is to the subtitle. Okay, but. See, as you're doing these word searches on Google and all, there's a lot of opportunities here for the book to come up. The Benedict Option was published in March of this year, and it's been described by David Brooks in the New York Times as the most discussed and most important religious book of the decade. I agree, and I think the Benedict Option should be required reading not only for all Christian leaders, but also, ideally, a requirement for church membership. While probably not infallible, the book is nonetheless very, very significant, very relevant, and very important. Now, since its publication, the Benedict Option has been extensively reviewed and critiqued. It's also been nitpicked probably more than any other book in recent history. This past summer, the Areopagus sponsored an 8-hour series of discussions on the Benedict Option, more time than we've ever devoted to a book other than to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The book is essentially divided into 2 sections. First is a diagnosis of the challenges facing contemporary American society and culture. And then secondly, are recommended solutions to these challenges that we face. Now, one would think that most all serious Christians would agree with the first part, and that is the problems that we currently face. However, after reading reviews and listening to people's comments, it became apparent to me that this really was not the case at all. Therefore, I wrote a short article entitled The Benedict Option, A Necessary Preface. We brought quite a few copies this evening, but I understand that we're out. So if you would be interested in that, the full text is on our website at www.theareopagus.org. And in that article, I emphasize 3 points on which Christians must agree if there's to be any real serious and fruitful discussions as far as the state of our society and the role of Christians today. And first of all, would be, is American society and culture actually getting progressively better or worse? Secondly, is there a culture war going on in America today? And if so, what exactly is at stake? And then thirdly, is true authentic Christianity innately countercultural? Again, unless there's a general consensus on those 3 points, it pretty much makes, as I said, any sort of real discussion and debate over the book rather unnecessary. So anyway, this is a great privilege for us this evening to welcome to our stage Rod Dreher. So please extend a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you.
God bless.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Thank you, Jeff, for that generous introduction. I cannot let it go to my head because there are at least two people in this room who remember me as one of the founders of Louisiana School Students for Mondale. I'm not very political today. I don't know how much I can trust my own political judgment, but I'm going to talk tonight about culture, which I think is much more important than politics. It precedes politics, in fact. But before I get into this speech, I wanted to encourage you to come next week to hear Ken Myers speak. He's the founder and host of Mars Hill Audio Journal. I dedicate the Benedict Option to Ken because there's been no single source that has been more formative for me as a Christian thinker than Ken Myers' Mars Hill Audio Journal. So this is really going to be a must-see event. And maybe tonight's a little bit of a warm-up for that. I like to joke about things. I come from South Louisiana. We can't help ourselves. But there's actually something really serious to talk about. There is a culture war. It is real, and indeed, it has become a war on reality itself. Nothing less than the souls of our children and our descendants are at stake. And Christians who hold to historic biblical orthodoxy are losing this war badly, much worse than most Christians today understand. This is not a matter of voting Republican or voting Democrat. This is something much more fundamental than that. It's like this. How many people here saw the movie Dunkirk this summer? Yeah, I did. Wonderful film. Or at least if you didn't see the movie, you know about the historical battle early in the Second World War. I think that movie provides a good way to understand the position of Christians in our culture today. We have been beaten back to a thin strip of beach with our back to the sea, metaphorically speaking. We have three choices. One, we can mount a forward assault on the enemy whose strength vastly outmatches our own. But if we do that, we're likely to be destroyed. Two, we can sit here quietly, minding our own business, and hope that we'll be left alone. If we do that, we're likely to be destroyed. Or we can get on the flotilla of boats waiting for us, evacuating the battleground and getting back to a metaphorical England. Our metaphorical England is not 100% safe. In fact, the real England in the Second World War, if not for the Royal Air Force, would have been overwhelmed by the Germans. Nevertheless, the relative safety of the historical England allowed the Allied armies to regroup, rearm, retrain, and get ready to go back into battle. What the British and their allies did at Dunkirk was a strategic retreat. They pulled back out of the moment so they could prepare better to meet the enemy on a future battlefield. So what I call the Benedict Option is a Dunkirk strategy for Christians who have our backs to the sea in the culture war. It's not cultural defeatism. It's not surrender. Ours is not a lost cause. I stand with T.S. Eliot, who said, quote, "If we take the widest and wisest view of a cause, there is no such thing as a lost cause, because there's no such thing as a gained cause. We fight for lost causes because we know that our defeat and dismay may be the preface to our successor's victory, though that victory itself will be temporary. We fight rather to keep something alive than in the expectation that it will triumph." In other words, we don't keep fighting necessarily because we expect to win. We fight because it is worth keeping something alive, because the victory may belong to future generations who have kept the faith. We fight so that our children and our children's children and their children will have a faith to keep. It will profit our descendants nothing if they gain the world or both houses of Congress and the presidency, but lose their soul. Many of you may be like me, political conservatives, and so I have to say it clearly. It is ultimately unimportant if the Republicans have control of the White House, Congress, and a majority of the Supreme Court. This is important, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not nearly the most important thing. The people who produce our culture are the real legislators of our world. It's very, very important to understand this. If you don't, You'll be prone to the same mistake that a lot of us Christian conservatives have been making for the last 30 or 40 years, thinking that if we just win the next election, the next political battle, the next legal battle, we've won. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's important to stay involved in politics, if only to fight for religious liberty, for the right to life, and other causes that should be near and dear to our hearts as Christians. But do not be deceived. Politics are not sufficient to fight the real enemy. Now, I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful, and I want you to leave here tonight hopeful too. What's the difference between optimism and hope? The optimist believes everything is going to keep getting better and better. I don't believe that's true. I believe that, in fact, that for faithful Christians, it's going to get worse, a lot worse, before it gets better. Optimists are not going to make it through what's to come because they will not have seen it coming and they'll not be prepared for it. Christian hope, on the other hand, is the conviction that even though we may not be able to see victory, we know that victory is ultimately ours. Jesus Christ has already won that victory. And if we unite our suffering and our struggles to His, we too shall ultimately be victorious. But here's the thing. When He died on the cross, that did not look like victory. In order to triumph, He had to undergo suffering and loss. As followers of Jesus, we know by faith that our suffering, when we suffer for Christ's sake, has ultimate meaning. We don't know what God is going to do with our sacrifices. It's not for us to say. All we know is that our task is to be faithful and to trust in Him. The martyrs of the church, they were not optimists. They were men and women of hope, a hope so profound that they were willing to lose everything, even their lives, for the sake of Christ. We should look to them for inspiration. Real hope is based on reality. Here's the reality. This is what we're facing today. Social hostility and legal restrictions will undermine the viability of many Christian institutions and significantly limit individual Christians' participation in many professions and aspects of public life in the United States within a generation or so. Due to a lack of meaningful discipleship and accommodation to various features of secularized modernity and consumer culture, the collapse of Christian belief and practice is likely among members of the dominant culture and many minority cultures in the United States within a generation or so. I believe this. These words are by my friend Andy Crouch, who is a real visionary evangelical leader, but he writes those to summarize the point of the Benedict Option, the critique of the Benedict Option within the book. This is not a drill. If I sound alarmist, well, from my perspective, there's a lot to be alarmed about. When I was a kid growing up in the 1970s, a lot of Christians were talking about the rapture, the tribulation, the end times. I'm not talking about that tonight. We may or may not be living through the end of the world, but we absolutely are living through the end of a world. To fail to see that is to leave yourself and your family and your community undefended. We absolutely cannot afford to live in denial. Now, it may not seem so dire to many people in this room, given the fact that we live in peace and prosperity. We're still free to go to church and pray. What's the big deal? Well, in truth, we're living through the religious and cultural equivalent of the great flood of the Bible. The floodwaters are what I call liquid modernity. It's not my phrase. It's a phrase coined by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman to describe the quality of constant churn, of constant change, characteristic of our era. For Bauman, modernity, which came into being around the time of the Reformation and the scientific revolution, modernity was solid when it first appeared. It was solid in the sense that a definite and radical change had been set in motion in society, but change happened at a rate that was absorbable. That is, people had time to get used to the religious, economic, scientific, and political changes, such that for most people, life itself felt manageable and solid. At some point in the 19th, certainly the 20th century, though, the rate of change sped up so fast that modernity went from solid to liquid. That is, before this or that change took solid form, things would change again. To live in liquid modernity, then, is to experience life as having no permanent landmarks or reliable pathways. It's as if we were drifting on a raft in a flood with no familiar markers to navigate by. In liquid modernity, you can go wherever your desire takes you. We live in a world today in which even the concepts of male and female are not solid, and in which in some places you can be fired and even charged with the crime for not going along with the new order, even in your language. This so-called gender ideology is the cutting edge of liquid modernity today, but it's not going to stop there. Liquid modernity has caused the loss of traditions, religious and otherwise. It has fomented the dissolution of bonds among people, a loss of shared authority, as well as a sense of connection to the past and to the future. We are living in an everlasting now. And liquid modernity has terribly compromised the ability of people on the left, right, and center to reason together and therefore to live together in peace. The political troubles that are now manifesting in our country are just the beginning of a time of real and increasingly churning trouble. People have come to see the truth as whatever feels true for them. This is what the Catholic moral philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre calls emotivism. You cannot argue with someone's feelings. And if you can't argue with someone's feelings, then how can you settle disputes? You can't except through the raw exercise of power. The experience of rapid fragmentation and tribalization that America is undergoing right now did not start with Donald Trump, nor did it start with the 1960s. It has been underway for a very long time, and it is now reaching a critical breaking point. In fact, Alasdair MacIntyre famously compared our civilization at this point in time to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. I suspect he's right about that, and that the most important thing for believing Christians to do is to stop caring so much about shoring up the imperium, by which I mean trying to defend the current social and political order. We should not be dedicating our primary passions to reforming and renewing an order that may be beyond saving. Instead, we should focus mainly, but not exclusively, on shoring up communities of faith in churches, schools, families, and other places for the long, dark age ahead. To put it plainly, nothing is more important than working to build Christian communities that are faithful, orthodox, countercultural, and resilient enough to withstand the tumult ahead, including, quite possibly, persecution. Alasdair MacIntyre said that today we await a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. I interpret this as saying that if we want to be faithful to the truth in this chaotic time, and the truth we know as the incarnate Jesus Christ, we lay people have to look to the example of the early Benedictine monks for inspiration and direction and how to live out our beliefs in community. And that we also have to use our creativity to make their wisdom relevant to us in this time and this place. More on this shortly. The discomforting truth is that we live in a post-Christian civilization. In this sense, our civilization no longer understands itself by the biblical narrative. In other words, some people say, what do you mean post-Christian? There are Christians everywhere. Churches are everywhere. Yes, absolutely, that's true. But the biblical narrative is no longer at the center of our broader culture. You can see it quite plainly in Europe, and we are headed very much clearly in the same direction. Now, this would be challenging enough to the Christian church if the church were in good shape. But the church in the West, not the global South, but the West, is in terrible shape overall. And our inability to recognize this and to face the facts squarely only makes it worse. The churches, generally speaking, I trust that this is a very strong church, but generally speaking, the churches are in a state of rapid decline, both in terms of quantity and quality. By quantity, I mean the number of people who claim to be Christian. In Europe, the Christian faith is flat on its back. One of my readers of my blog wrote to say he was in Scotland recently, and Sunday church-going in Scotland is something like 1% of the population in Scotland, and it's not a whole lot better elsewhere across the continent. This is true in both Protestant and Catholic countries. In the United States, we long thought that we were an exception to the secularization trend, but that's no longer the case. The bottom has fallen out with the millennial generation. A couple of years ago, two of the leading sociologists of religion, surveying the most recent data from social science, concluded that the United States has at long last joined Europe on the steep downward slide to de-Christianization. There's really nowhere to hide from it now. So that's quantity. By quality, I'm talking about the nature of Christian belief. As many of you who follow my work on my blog and in my writings know, I draw the bulk of my diagnosis from the research of Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith and his colleagues. Smith and his colleagues have found overwhelmingly that the de facto religion of American young people is what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. MTD is a shallow, feel-good form of Christianity that has very little to do with historical biblical faith. MTD tells us that God exists and he wants us to be nice and happy. We don't have to consult him unless we need something. And that's pretty much it. There's no talk about, there's no prophetic mode in moralistic therapeutic deism. It's all about feeling good and anesthetized. Smith and his team have found that 60% of young adults aged 18 to 23 say that their moral beliefs are not grounded in the Bible or any kind of religious authority. And note well that just because they claim that their beliefs are based in the Bible or religious authority does not mean that they're living out any kind of biblically coherent morality. For most young Americans today, this has been documented, truth is what feels right to them as autonomous, choosing individuals. But a faith that is not grounded in anything other than emotivism cannot survive, and it won't survive. Christian Smith says that most millennials are lost in a sea of moral relativism and moral individualism. Most of them cannot see any concept of the good life beyond being prosperous and happy. Smith does not blame young people for this. They are the products of parents, churches, schools, and a popular culture that did not show them anything different. And I know this is true from my own experience. I'm 50 years old. I was raised this way in a small town in the Deep South in the 1970s. You know, church was something that we were all Christians, so we didn't have to go to church to prove that. You know, we were Methodist, and the Methodist church was a church we didn't go to. And it was like Kierkegaard describing 19th century Copenhagen. In a society in which everybody is a Christian just by being born into it, Christianity ceases to exist. We were all conservatives back then, and we were all Christians, so to speak, but nobody took it that seriously, or very few people took it that seriously. Well, that was then. That was 50 years ago. Now we're seeing the fruits of moralistic therapeutic deism. And again, it didn't start with the millennials, but it's been an ongoing process. If we Christians think that we're all that different from the culture around us, we're not paying attention to what's actually happening in our culture. Far too many of our churches have contented themselves for a very long time with being the middle class at prayer. Even many churches that are more actively engaged with their youth than other churches are failing. When I travel to Christian colleges, both Catholic and evangelical, I hear the very same thing from professors and campus ministers. Young people are coming to these colleges out of Christian high schools and church youth programs knowing almost nothing about the Christian faith. Worse, they don't even know how little they know and why that's important. For them, the Christian faith primarily consists of managing their emotional experience of Christ and being nice to others. Here's a true story. Earlier this year, I was speaking at a conservative evangelical college campus, and I gave a talk about the importance of practices in Christian discipleship. That is, things like regular fasting, regular prayer, and so forth in building Christian character. I talked about this as a form of spiritual training and what that means to form ourselves to Christ. So at the end of my talk in the Q&A, a young woman stood up and said, "Sir, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why isn't it enough to love Jesus with all our hearts like we were taught to do growing up?" Well, I explained that love has to take concrete form or it will not withstand any time of trial. Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." If we're going to be faithful to our Lord, I told her, we have to develop the habits that train ourselves to walk in his footsteps and do not stray. This is what discipleship means. It's an ordinary part of Christian living and has been since forever. We've forgotten that today. But I could tell this young woman didn't really understand what I was saying. So after the talk, a professor came to me and said, "You know, what that young lady told you is how 99% of the students on our campus think." This is a conservative evangelical campus. He said, "They've come out of a church culture that teaches them that faith is entirely relational. That's not so bad for them when they come to our campus," he said, "where they spend their 4 years among people who are a lot like themselves. But when they get out into the world and they run into people who tell them that what Christianity teaches is mean, they fall apart." Along those lines, I was at another conservative evangelical college having dinner with professors, and I praised the fact that evangelicals are better than the rest of us American Christians at teaching the faith to their youth. Again, I was basing this on Christian Smith's research. He finds that most every Christian church in America is doing a poor job passing the faith on, but evangelicals are doing better than Catholics and Orthodox and others. The professors at that table, though, cautioned me not to romanticize evangelicals. One of them said to me, quote, "I doubt that most of the kids at our college will ever be able to form stable families." I was really shocked by that. Here at a conservative Christian college? Why do you say that? He replied, "Because so few of them have ever seen one." And the other professors around the table nodded. He went on to say, "We do the best we can in the 4 years that we have them, but it's almost never enough. They come here so broken." There were tears in that man's eyes. I thought of that dinner recently when an evangelical theologian friend told me about a couple of talks he had given at a conservative Christian high school in the South. He told me that the questions from the students, again, all of these from conservative, middle-class, church-going evangelical families, the questions showed that they knew almost nothing about Christian sexual morality or Christian teaching on marriage and the family. They had been catechized not by their church, not by their Christian school, but by popular culture. It left my theologian friend shaking. He's a new father, and he said, "What kind of world am I bringing my own daughter up in?" So over and over, I hear these kinds of stories from the front lines. You should see my mailbox, my email box every day. Headmasters at Christian schools, as well as pastors in local churches, they often tell me that no matter what they do, they can't seem to wake their parishioners up, especially parents, and make them understand that they can't simply outsource the formation of their kids to school or to church and not get involved. If parents aren't completely bought in to the mission of raising Christian kids, it's just not going to happen. To be fair, though, I also hear from parents who say that they feel alone, that their church or the Christian school doesn't really have their back. Well, what if we lived in a situation in which families, churches, schools, and Christian communities worked together on the mission of discipling both children and adults and communities in a countercultural way? That's the goal of the Benedict Option. In 2015, when I was visiting a monastery in Italy, Father Cassian Folsom, the monastery's leader, heard my idea and then told me about a community of lay Catholics on the other side of the mountain who were living out this plan, this Benedict Option. Father Cassian said to me, "Christians who don't do something like that are not going to make it through what's coming." So let's review. We Christians have been in a culture war for a long, long time, and we have been thoroughly routed. We now live in a post-Christian culture, one that is fast de-Christianizing. Americans, especially the millennial generation and younger, are leaving the faith in unprecedented numbers. 40% of the millennial generation say they have no affiliation at all with any church. 40%. Never seen anything like that in American history. Plus, even the barest sense of Christian orthodoxy, of biblical orthodoxy, of anything that looks historically Christian, is very quickly fading. This is not a temporary setback. It's the end result of deep cultural currents that have been building for centuries. At this point, it cannot be turned back, not by politics, not by favorable judicial rulings or anything else. It can only be endured until it runs its course. Our challenge as Christians is to figure out how to endure faithfully. The church, by which I mean the entire community of believers, is unprepared for what's happening now and what's going to come. Liquid modernity is coming at us like a tsunami, and if we don't act now, we're going to be wiped out. So that's the diagnosis. What do we do about it? It's here that we turn to the rule of St. Benedict, written by the founder of Western monasticism in the early 6th century amid the ruins of the Western Roman Empire's collapse. Notice I say the Western Roman Empire. I know there are Orthodox Christians in this room. The Roman Empire continued on in the East for another 1,000 years or so. But in the West, it collapsed. I believe that St. Benedict, has the secret for the church's survival in this new dark age, and I'm going to explain why. The collapse of the Western Empire did not happen overnight, but it was a terrible shock to the Romans all the same. They honestly could not believe, could scarcely comprehend that the structures, the way of life that had lasted for many centuries, that they were gone. The sack of the city of Rome itself in the year 410 was the first time in 800 years that the city had been attacked by invaders. 800 years. And it had never been attacked by invaders. It was sacked in 410. That was such a traumatic event that St. Augustine wrote the city of God to reassure his flock that God was in charge. The last Caesar, Romulus Augustulus, abdicated in the year 476, forced out of power by a conquering barbarian king. 4 years after that, in a village called Nursia in the mountains of central Italy, a boy named Benedict was born to Christian parents. He was a twin. His sister was Saint Scholastica. When he came of age, Benedict's parents sent him down to the city of Rome to complete his education. But he gets down to Rome, and he finds nothing but chaos and decadence. He was so disgusted by it that he turned his back on the city and his studies and retreated to a cave in the woods at Subiaco, outside of Rome. There he fasted, and there he prayed for 3 years, seeking God's will. When he emerged, he went on to found the monastic order that to this day bears his name. Now, Benedict wrote a rule, which is a simple guidebook for how to live in a monastery. In fact, I remember when I read the rule for the first time, I thought I was going to be encountering a little thin book of mystical sayings of the Desert Fathers, something like that. It's not that at all. It's meat and potatoes. This is how we live together in community. But there's so much profundity in this rule hidden beneath its everydayness. Benedict wrote this rule and founded monastic communities. When he died in the year 547, Benedict, who by the way was never ordained a priest, left behind 12 or 13, I forget exactly how many, monasteries in the vicinity of Rome. That man could not have imagined what God was going to do with the little mustard seed of faith he planted in that garden. Benedict did not try to save Roman civilization or to make Rome great again. All he wanted to do was to put God first in his life in a radical way and to serve the Lord in community. In fact, Benedict called the monastery a, quote, school for the Lord's service. Well, over the next few centuries, Benedictine monasticism spread like wildfire amid the chaos and poverty of Dark Ages Europe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the monks built monasteries that served as sanctuaries of light, of peace, of stability, of prayer, of worship, and of learning. Simply by being faithful to and disciplined in their calling and sharing the fruits of their prayer and labor with those outside the monastery, those monks laid the groundwork for the rebirth of Christian civilization centuries after it fell. Cardinal John Henry Newman, the great 19th century Catholic, characterized St. Benedict's accomplishments like this, quote, St. Benedict found the world, physical and social, in ruins, and his mission was to restore it in the way not of science, but of nature, not as if setting about to do it, not professing to do it by any set time, or by any rare specific, or by any series of strokes, but quietly, patiently, gradually, that often till the work was done, it was not known to be doing. Silent men were observed about the country, or discovered in the forest, digging, clearing, and building. And other silent men, not seen, were sitting in the cold cloister, tiring their eyes and keeping their attention on the stretch, while they painfully copied and recopied the manuscripts which they could have saved. There was no one who contended or cried out or drew attention to what was going on, but by degrees the woody swamp became a hermitage, a religious house, a farm, and an abbey, a village, a seminary, a school of learning, and finally, a city. Close quote. The work of rebuilding out of the ruins of civilization was long and it was hard. It required patience, it required resilience, it required the ability to take the long view, and above all, it required a faith that was willing to suffer. It's going to have to be the same way with us Christians today. Now, we're not called to the monastic life. We live in the world. We're lay people. But if we're going to be Christ's faithful disciples in this post-Christian world, then we are going to have to recover some of the spiritual and moral discipline that the Benedictine monks have always had and embodied in their communities. Almost 2 years ago, I spent a week at the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, as St. Benedict's hometown is called today, praying with the monks there, eating with them, and interviewing them for my book about their way of life. From those conversations and from studying the rule of St. Benedict, I discerned a number of ways we Christians living in the world, Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox, can adapt monastic insights to our way of life in the world. These involve a mixture of prayer, contemplation, scripture study, asceticism, work, and building local community. I don't have the time tonight to discuss them in depth. That's in the book. But I will say that the ultimate goal of all of these things, and of this strategy, is to bring us closer, individually and in families and communities, to transformative union with God. For the Benedictine monks, religion is not part of life, it is a way of life. It has to be the same way with us. I don't want there to be any confusion at all on this point. We lay Christians are not called to head for the hills. Somebody's going to raise their hand and say, so you're saying we're called to head for the hills? No, I'm not. We're not called to head for the hills. We're called to the world. But if we do not join the monks in ways appropriate to our lay status in embracing the Christian faith, not simply as part of our lives, but as the way we live in all things, and the way we live in conscious opposition to the ways of the post-Christian world, then we're simply not going to be strong enough to resist that world. So what lessons do the Benedictine monks have to offer us? Well, first, they teach us the importance of order. This is not mere discipline or acts of the will. It goes a lot deeper than that. Order, in the Benedictine sense, is the belief that there exists a transcendent hierarchy that we see through a glass darkly. We must try, with God's grace, to conform our lives to this order, at whose center is Jesus Christ, the incarnate Logos. The Reformed theologian Hans Boersma says that the modern condition, liquid modernity, makes it hard to perceive this. We are not just called to trust in Christ for eternal salvation, but we are called to participate in God's life, and do that in part by recognizing that He is everywhere present and fills all things. The world is not dead matter, but a sacrament. The world is iconic. The world are signs through which God mysteriously reveals Himself to us. This was the view of the fathers of the church, and this view was universal in Christendom until around the 14th century. We have lost the sense of awe made manifest to us in creation. We have to regain that. One of the monks of Norcia told me that all of us believers must order our lives so that the radiance of God can shine through us. And believe me, if you go to Norcia and you visit those monks, you can see the fruits of the Spirit in their very countenance. These are men who are profoundly at peace in the Lord. We do this by resolving to order everything we do to practicing the presence of God among us. Well, what kinds of things do we do? First among them, of course, is prayer. The radiance that monk spoke of is the fruit of deep and constant prayer, worshiping God with our hearts, souls, minds, and our bodies. Here's an interesting thing I learned when I was researching the Benedict Option. I read a book called How Societies Remember by a British cultural anthropologist named Paul Connerton. Connerton is not a believer. In fact, I think he's probably a Marxist, judging by his rhetoric. But he had some really interesting things to say about small societies and cultures that managed to hold on to their traditions in the face of modernity. He wanted to look and see how they had done it, and he found that they had several things in common. In general, they all had a sacred story, a story that they considered to be the story that explained who they are and what they were supposed to do. Secondly, they celebrated this sacred story in ritual, a common ritual. Third, they believed that in some sense that ritual took them outside of time. And finally, they worshipped this sacred story, or the God who was the author of this sacred story, using their bodies. I found that so interesting. In other words, their worship took them outside of their heads. Connerton has this lovely phrase in which he said, worshiping with their bodies sedimented the story into their bones. I think that's fascinating, and we can see why worship with our bodies is so important. Well, second thing we have to pay attention to is our work. We recognize that what we do in the world is to participate ultimately in God's creative work in the world. Our work should be a kind of prayer. All honest labor, no matter how humble and seemingly pointless, can and should be honoring to God. Third, we practice asceticism. That comes from the Greek word askesis, which means self-discipline, usually self-discipline for a religious end. This means things like regular fasting and other practices by which we train to deny ourselves physical pleasures so that we can learn to prefer God's will to our own. Because as we know, man does not live by bread alone. This trains us to suffer deprivation for Christ's sake. Fourth, we practice the art of living in community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "A Christian needs another Christian who speaks God's word to him. He needs him again and again when he becomes uncertain and discouraged. For by himself, he cannot help himself without belying the truth. He needs his brother man as a bearer and proclaimer of the divine word of salvation." Close quote. Community life is not a dreamy ideal, said Bonhoeffer, but an often difficult initiation into the, quote, divine reality that is the church. We cannot neglect the importance of community to our own formation and the formation of our children. And we have to be intentional about this too. With so many forces in contemporary culture pulling families and communities apart, we can't simply assume that everything is going to work out if we just go with the flow. True story, I was in Southern California in Orange County a couple of weeks ago giving a Benedict Option talk. Some PCA, Presbyterian pastors, came to me afterwards and said that they're really struggling there in Orange County because so many parents can't understand why they should have to come to church on Sunday morning when their kid has a soccer game or some sports event. I said, wait, are you serious? It shows you how out of it I am, living my own little Benedict Option life in Baton Rouge. They said, oh no, this is a really big deal. I said, but how do they expect to raise Christian kids if they're going to show the kids by what they do on Sunday morning that sports is more important than God? They said, that's the culture we live in. If you show your kids that sports means more than church, believe me, they're going to take a lesson. My dad did that with me when I was 17 years old and told him I didn't believe in God and I didn't want to go to church on Easter Sunday morning with Mom when I was home from school. And he said, oh no, you're going with your mom. I said, why aren't you going? Oh, I'm going wild turkey hunting. And I said, tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll read the Bible at home for an hour if you won't hassle me to go to church with Mom, and I won't hassle you about hunting. He made the deal, and my dad was a good man, but I never took anything else he said seriously about church and about God ever again after that, because I knew what mattered more in our family. Benedict Option Christians have a lot to learn, believe it or not, from our Orthodox Jewish elder brothers in the faith. Jews have faced horrifying attempts over the centuries to destroy their families and communities, shamefully, usually at the hands of Christians. Orthodox Rabbi Mark Gottlieb told me that Christians living apart from mainstream culture need, quote, raw, roll-up-your-sleeves dedication to create deep structures of community. If we're to survive, he told me, we need to develop, quote, a laser-like focus and dedication to seeing ourselves, talking about Christians, as the next link in the chain of the Christian story, going all the way back to the cross. The rabbi told me, quote, that sense of urgency, of making family come first in your life, strikes me as one starting point and foundational requirement for faithful Christians. Of course, he means God has to come first in your life, but being the father and the mother and the family, and making sure your family is formed to God as you understand Him, is the most important thing. He said there has to be a very deliberate commitment to the growth of one's family and the development of healthy and faithful service to one's family within the faith. This is not simply a matter of making sure our kids are embedded in a healthy Christian community. The same goes for us adults. We're also susceptible to influences from the post-Christian culture that cause us to compromise our faith. Parents cannot expect their children to be countercultural if they aren't countercultural as well. Our norms, too, are set and defined by the communities we inhabit. The world, as I've said, is rapidly de-Christianizing. If we're part of a community of people, of Christians, who don't recognize this and make conscious decisions to live in a countercultural way, then we too could easily be lulled into conformity and assimilation. Fifth, we observe hospitality. Back to the Benedictine list. We observe hospitality. In his rules, St. Benedict commands his monks to welcome the stranger as if he were Christ himself. Yet there is a prudent limit to this hospitality. If you go to a monastery, the monks are happy to see you, but they're not going to compromise their way of life to accommodate you. They believe that if they don't stick to their way of life, they couldn't be the kind of Christian you look for in a monastery for wise counsel. One of the monks in Norcia told me, he said, look, people come here, pilgrims come here to see us with their spiritual problems. They need prayer, they need counsel. The only way we can be for them who Christ wants us to be as monks is to spend so much time in prayer behind the cloister wall. If we let everybody come into our monastery and stay as long as they want in the conditions they wanted, we would lose our savor as salt. Benedictine monasteries, as I said, are hospitable, but they're not seeker-friendly communities. Rather, they're finder-friendly communities. Similarly with us in the church out in the world, our doors should be wide open to the world, but not to the extent that we surrender or water down our beliefs and our practices to be more accommodating to the world. If we do that, then we offer lost and hurting people nothing that they can't find elsewhere. Sixth, we live a balanced life. If you regard your family and your Christian community as countercultural, it's possible to live with a lot of zeal. I see it all the time. This can be really good, but it can also lead to a life-denying rigidity and even extremism. I interviewed in the book a young woman who was an atheist, had lost her faith, as her two elder siblings had, because her family, her parents, were so anxious about the corrupting world that they moved out to the woods to a very, very serious and sort of a siege-like Catholic community and trained their kids to be afraid of the world. And she said when we finally got out, we wanted nothing to do with religion because they thought that this is what the faith was, this being constantly afraid of the world. We've got to be careful about that. St. Benedict's rule is really good about that, about balance in all things. This balanced approach also corrects us when we're tempted to spend too much time in one activity to the neglect of others that are important to our formation. Like, say, if you're a blogger and you sit on the internet till midnight and you forget your evening prayers. I know somebody like this. For example, though, even if you're always doing things at church, you might be neglecting ordinary family life. And you might not see it because you think being at church is a good thing. You're helping build your community. St. Benedict says no, that rightly ordering your life requires living with balance. And finally, we embrace stability. Now, this is something unique to Benedictine spirituality. When a man takes his final vows as a Benedictine monk, one of those vows is a vow of stability. This means that he promises to stay in that particular monastery until the day he dies. It's like being married, but married to a particular community. In the first chapter of his rule, St. Benedict condemned the gyrovague as the worst kind of monk. Gyrovague, the worst kind of monk. A gyrovague was a religious tourist. He was the kind of monk who would flit around from monastery to monastery, taking what he wanted without committing to anything or anybody else. Well, spiritual growth cannot happen unless you're planted somewhere, Benedict believed. Same is true for us. We're called to be not tourists, but pilgrims. As such, we have to quit seeing the church like consumers do, as a place that meets our needs, and which we can walk away from easily if it ceases to do so. We also, and this has been a hard lesson for me to learn, but I've learned it. We also need to adapt this attitude towards life in general. I've lived most of my life as a secular gyrovague, but it was only with the untimely death of my sister Ruthie from cancer that I saw the value, indeed the necessity, of a stable life rooted in commitment to a particular community. I was the guy who moved around all over the country following my career. My sister stayed behind in our little town in Louisiana, married her high school sweetheart, taught in the local public school. When she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, the whole town rushed to help her and stayed with her and carried her and her husband and kids and our parents through that long pilgrimage of 19 months until she passed. And they held the family together after she passed. It was a beautiful thing to see, and it changed my heart so much that my wife and I decided to move back down to Louisiana. Not because the people in Philadelphia where we were living are worse than people in Louisiana, but because that's where I had roots, and that's where our family was, and that's where the people I knew were. And it wasn't Philadelphia. It might have been Philadelphia if we had stayed there for a while, but we had never stayed in any one place long enough to put down roots, because we were gyrovagues. I hope that's behind us now. So to recap, the lessons we laymen learn from the rule of St. Benedict have to do with the importance of prayer, of work, of asceticism, of hospitality, community, and stability integrated into a balanced order of life. Now, this is not the gospel, but it is a way of living the gospel in everyday life. It's not a rule for the sake of following a rule, but a rule that keeps us on the straight path on our pilgrimage through life towards unity with God in heaven. Now, you're no doubt thinking, how can we fulfill the Great Commission if we take refuge in Benedict Option communities? How can we be salt and light in the world if we withdraw? Well, the answer can be found in 2 passages from the Old Testament. The first is Jeremiah 29. Speaking through the prophet to the Jews in exile in Babylon, and I know most of you in this room know this passage, the Lord told them to make their homes there in Babylon, that he had brought them there for his own purposes. He told them to seek the peace and prosperity of the city into which he carried them into exile. God also told them not to listen to false prophets, by which he means those who told the exile community, don't worry, you're soon going to be returning, we're all going to be going home soon. God said that's going to happen one day, but not now. So this is where we are as believers in the 21st century. You know, we used to think that America was our home, it was a Christian nation, and so on, even though we had the separation of church and state. Most people in this country were Christian and faithful to one degree or another. And it's a place that, however, imperfectly strive to live by Christian values. Well, America, for better or worse, is no longer that place. Faithful Christians have to recognize that we're living as exiles now, and we have to embrace that status, even as we are embedded in that foreign land, and we work for the common good, for its peace and prosperity. A side note on this, I was in France recently, and you won't be surprised to know it is a very, very secular nation. I felt like the French are living where America is going to be in another generation or two, so I paid close attention to the Christians I met there. I had a lot of conversations with older Christians who seemed intent on maintaining the fiction that France really still cared to hear what Christians had to say in the public square, and if they just were more winsome, that people would listen to them and give them a place of honor. I could tell that these Christians were trimming their sails to maintain what they imagined was their cultural relevance. Plus task. By contrast, the young Christians I met, those in their 20s and 30s, they didn't live by this illusion. They seemed to be perfectly aware that modern France has no use for them, but this liberated them to live their lives fully dedicated to Christ. All of them worked and lived in the world. These weren't people hiving off in any kind of commune, but they put Christ first, and they ordered their lives to worshiping Him and serving Him without worrying about what the world thinks or how they can influence the culture or take back France for Christ. Now, if France will ever return to its Christian roots, I believe it's going to be because of what God does through those sold-out young Christians who embrace their marginal status, not through those believers who are so desperate to remain respectable and accepted in the public square that they put their light under a bushel. So Jeremiah 29 is one way to see our role in the post-Christian world, as embedded in it and working as we can for the common good. But Daniel chapter 3 provides the balance. That's where the prophet tells the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew men who were high officials of King Nebuchadnezzar. You can't get more embedded in an alien culture than that, serving the king. But when the king ordered them to bow down and worship an idol, they chose the prospect of death in a fiery furnace before apostasy. Well, how did they do that? How did those three men live so that when put to the test, they chose God, even at the cost of their lives? How did they live in Babylon without Babylon living in them? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but it's easy to guess. They kept the law and the faith, including all the communal practices that are required of faithful Jews living in a covenant community. It told them who they were and what they were to do. Their story was not Babylon's story, and they never let themselves forget it. It has to be this way with Christians today. We must never cease to tell our story to ourselves, and not only tell ourselves a story, but live our story in everyday life and practice. I think this is going to be the best way to evangelize, by the way. Some years ago, Robert Wilkin, the esteemed historian of the early church, issued this stark warning. He wrote, "Nothing is more needful today than the survival of Christian culture, because in recent generations, this culture has become dangerously thin. At this moment in the church's history in this country and in the West more generally, it is less urgent to convince the alternative culture in which we live of the truth of Christ than it is for the church to tell itself its own story and to nurture its own life. This is not going to happen without a rebirth of moral and spiritual discipline and a resolute effort on the part of Christians to comprehend and to defend the remnants of Christian culture." Close quote. Well, that's the purpose of the Benedict Option. In the West today, the church's story is no longer the common story. Even people who are within the church, as I've said, don't even know the church's story. You'd be shocked by how many professors at Christian colleges tell me they have to do basic teaching of Bible stories to kids who come out of Catholic and evangelical schools. I mean, it's shocking. Even I, who grew up in the 70s in a nominally Christian household, know more than a lot of these kids. How did this happen to us? To know the church's story and to sediment it into our bones requires stepping back from the world. This is necessary because when we return to the world in our daily lives, we have to do so as bearers of Christ to that world. In other words, if we are going to be for the world as our Lord commands us to be, then we're going to have to spend serious time away from that world in spiritual formation. Otherwise, the salt cannot help but lose its savor. And if you think about it, Christ himself, before he would minister, he would go out to the desert and pray. and then go out to the people, and then withdraw. This is ordinary Christian life too. When we go into church on Sunday, it's not just a pep rally. We're going there to worship and to be built up so that we can go out into the world in the coming week to serve Him and to bear witness to Christ. This is what the Benedict option is. It's just doing this in a lot more intentional way and more disciplined way. Pope Francis likes to say that the church is a field hospital, and I think he's right about that. But the Pope should follow the metaphor to its logical conclusion. You don't heal the spiritually wounded by sending out to them an army of untrained, unformed medics who have nothing to offer but enthusiasm and a sack full of opioids. That will only take the pain away temporarily. Now, if you want to heal them, you send them medics who know how to heal and who know that the way to true healing may require pain. My priest told me that one time. He said, he used the same field hospital metaphor. He said, a lot of people come to the church hurting and broken and needing healing, but they only think they want healing. So when you talk to them, you realize they just want somebody to tell them it's going to be okay and that they don't have to change. And I try to tell them, look, if you want to be healed, the medicine is here, but it's going to require surgery, and that's going to hurt. That's when you know if people are serious about wanting to be healed or not, if they're willing to suffer for the sake of healing. Real Christianity heals brokenness. False Christianity, it only masks the pain. If we're going to offer real Christianity to the world, we need training and formation in spiritual and moral discipline. We really are in a war, and we're losing it badly. In fact, you might even say, to use another military metaphor, that we Christians are living under a kind of occupation. Which brings me to my final story. As I was preparing to research the Benedict Option book, I asked Professor Michael Hanby, a philosopher, for advice on how to approach this research. He thought for a minute and he said, always ask yourself, what would Wojtyła do? Well, Wojtyła was the last name of Pope John Paul II. I told him I didn't really understand what he was getting at. Well, Professor Hanby explained that after the German army overran Poland in 1939, it was pointless to resist the Germans directly. The Nazis' power was too great. But that did not give the Poles permission to throw their hands up and give up. Young Karol Wojtyła, who would enter the seminary during the war, he at that time was an amateur actor. He and his theatrical circle understood that the Nazis intended not simply to rule them, the Poles, but to eradicate from their cultural memory what it meant to be Polish and what it meant to be Catholic Christians. Those actors decided to fight to preserve that cultural memory by writing plays, some of them on patriotic themes and some on Christian themes, and staging them underground in clandestine locations. Now, had the Gestapo ever found out about this, they would have arrested and maybe even killed every actor and every member of the audience. But everybody there, the actors, the playwrights, the director, and those who went to see those plays, understood that preserving the cultural memory of what it meant to be Polish and what it meant to be Christian was an act of deep and critical resistance to the occupation. And they succeeded. This, too, by the way, is why the Polish church was such a steadfast opponent of the other totalitarian evil of the 20th century, Soviet communism. Who would have guessed that that little troupe of actors who risked their lives to serve Christ by keeping the memory of Christianity alive through the Nazi occupation would one day produce a priest who would become pope and who would lead the resistance that brought down European communism? It's incredible. So we don't know what God will do with our mustard seed of faith. We only have to be faithful despite the times. So the question to all of us tonight, I would like everybody to leave here asking, what would Wojtyła do? And for that matter, what would Benedict do if he or they were living in our time and our place, facing our own challenges? The order that we've come to take for granted, it's collapsing in front of our eyes, not just the religious and cultural order, but I think we're going to see the fall of the political order too. I hope I'm wrong about that, but we can't take anything for granted anymore. But we should go forward with clarity of vision and understand that the most important form of resistance we can offer is through building and strengthening authentic Christian culture firmly anchored in Scripture and Christian tradition. Now, authentic Christian culture will look somewhat different in different places, but it will proclaim that in the kingdom of God, nature, time, and place are sacred and have ultimate meaning in Christ. This is precisely what post-Christian culture desires. This is what I meant by saying that we're in a war on reality itself. And make no mistake, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're all going to be put to the test one day, and probably more than once. The way we respond then, depends on the way we respond now. In the Benedict Option, I quote the Lutheran pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who survived torture and confinement in communist prisons in Romania. Once he was free, Wurmbrand wrote that there are two kinds of Christians, quote, those who sincerely believe in God and those who, just as sincerely, believe that they believe. You can tell them apart by their actions in decisive moments, close quotes. We are engaged in spiritual warfare, my friends. Neutrality is not an option. Whoever is not for Christ in a consciously countercultural way will end up by default against him. I give you the Benedict Option as the best strategy we have to fight for Christ's cause today. I don't have all the answers, but I'm telling you, if you have a better answer, I want to hear it because I have skin in this game. I have 3 kids. I hope I have grandkids one day. I have people I love in my church community, in our Christian school community. I want us to make it, and I want the best ideas we have. Pope Benedict XVI said that Christians in the post-Christian West have to be creative minorities. I think this is the call to all of us, whatever our church. We fight as St. Benedict fought, and as young Karol Wojtyła fought, not in the expectation that we will see victory in our lifetime, but rather to keep the faith alive in this new dark age so that the victory may belong to future generations, maybe even centuries from now, who will be alive to see the church's very own D-Day. Thank you very much.
Rod, thank you. Thank you so much for a very thoughtful and provoking and challenging talk. We have about 15 minutes that we can do Q&A. And one of the things about Q&A, this session is being taped. We like for everyone in the room to be able to hear the questions and the people who watch the tape to be able to hear the questions as well. So there are 2 microphones. I have one. Eric Smith has one over there. We'll take questions one at a time. One of us will pass you a microphone. In order to make sure that we can get as many questions in as possible, if you would ask your question, note a question, right? Ask a question, make it straightforward if you can, and pass the microphone back to whoever gave it to you so we can get ready to get the next person in line to have a question. Make sense? And we'll go to about 5 after 9. We good?
That's fine, yeah. Sorry I took so long, but I kind of get wound up about this stuff.
All right. So, sometimes I say, no one wants to ask the first question, so we'll go straight to the second question. But we have a intrepid volunteer. If you would.
Yes, would you comment on the thought, Christian to pagan in 3 generations? I see it in my father and 3 generations from him, or 2 generations from him.
Yeah. Well, in the book I talk about some people I know down south who there were 2 older women talking. I'll just leave it at that. And one of them said to the other one that she had been that year to 6 baby showers for her different nieces in her family, or extended family. And all these women had children by multiple men, was not married to any one of them, and this had become normal in that family. And she wondered, how did this happen? This was a good, working class, strong Christian family, and it collapsed in 1 or 2 generations like that. I think this is what happens when we assume that the structures we grew up with will always hold. I mean, my mom and dad were good people. They imagined that the Christian world that they grew up in was going to be normative and that it wasn't going to change so quickly. But they were wrong about that, and only by the grace of God, I think, that my sister and I managed to hold on to the faith. But my parents were like everybody else. They just didn't see how fast things were changing. And they didn't see how fast things were changing, in part because television was piping in all the values and a narrative and a set of narratives that ran contrary to the narratives that they wanted to give us, that our local culture was giving us. That was good in some cases, but it is really bad in others. Well, now the internet is like that times 100. And this is how I think you go from Christian to pagan in 3 generations, by simple neglect, or by going along to get along and assuming that the faith is simply part of our life instead of our whole life. That's why what we're going through right now is a sorting of the wheat and the chaff. Because if we don't live intentionally as Christians, then our grandchildren will not be.
Your talk is extremely timely. I'm very glad that I was here. The question is, do you see the Benedict option at work? And if so, do you have some examples right here now?
Benedict option in work.
At work.
At work. Well, in the book, what I talk about mostly in the Benedict option in work, I wanted to do a chapter on what it's like to integrate your spirituality into your work. But I ended up speaking mostly about the challenges I believe Christians in this country are going to face in the decades to come to their livelihood, because they will not be able to go along with certain practices or laws that will, for example, the lawyers. There's an attempt right now among lawyers in the American Bar Association to blackball traditional Christians who don't accept the evolving secular view of LGBT rights. And it's a matter not simply of respecting religious liberty, but of keeping them from becoming lawyers. I had a Catholic doctor who told me, a very prominent Catholic doctor, who said that he would not let his children go to medical school. Like, why not? Because he's been very successful. He said, because I can see what's coming in our profession. Doctors, I believe, this is the Catholic doctor speaking, so I believe that doctors are, in the course of my kid's lifetime, going to be forced to agree to perform abortions and euthanasia, or they won't be able to practice medicine. He said, we've avoided it in my generation, but I don't think it's going to happen in my kids' generation. And he said, I think what will happen is so many doctors, Christian kids, will go into medical school and get $400,000 in debt, and then suddenly they'll have to agree to do these things, or they won't be able to pay their debt off. He said, that's a trap that I don't want my kids to fall into. Well, that's a pretty radical thing to say, that, oh, Christians shouldn't go into medicine. I don't know if he would actually say that as a blanket statement, but he was just telling me what he's seeing in his own line of work. And he's really high up in the medical field, and he's seeing it at a very senior level. I've heard similar things from lawyers and law professors. So that's the main thing that the Benedict Options work chapter focuses on. I believe, though, that the Benedictines have their motto is ora et labora, prayer and labor, prayer and work, because they believe the two were combined, that we served God not only with our prayer, but we made our work sort of a prayer. And in that sense, I see even humble physical labor that we think might seem meaningless to us, it can actually take on a dimension of holiness. In fact, St. Benedict, I think this is in his rule, he says that when a monk in the monastery comes to love the profession he does so much that he takes pride in what he does, then it's time to move him to another job, because ultimately we serve God with our labor, not ourselves and our own ego. That is something so countercultural that we can hardly imagine it today, but that is the way the Benedictines lived for the sake of putting God first in all things.
I have a question here.
Thank you so much for coming. My question has to do with the topic that you brought up earlier, emotivism. And I was wondering, could you uncover a little bit more, maybe drill down deeper into the roots of that, or maybe point us toward, maybe a very short bibliography that we can use to educate ourselves. You mentioned Alistair McIntyre, and I'm familiar with After Virtue, but not other things that he's written.
Well, he's really hard to read, McIntyre. But emotivism is something that has come about. It didn't come about overnight. As we moved into the 20th century, and as people came to distrust radically the truth claims and to contest them all the time, they lost faith in reason. I'm oversimplifying here. And if we can't know things independently, that things are objectively true, we can know our own feelings. And you see this today in a lot of the identity politics people have. They feel that if you challenge, or they believe that if you challenge their feelings, you are challenging their identity in some way, and it becomes impossible to argue with them. But what happens is we become locked into a solipsistic like a cage in which we're only looking back at mirrors surrounding us. I was talking to Dr. Brashears today about to my friend Darren, who's here tonight, about one of my children who has such strong emotions. And when he's upset about something, he's 14 years old, but when he gets upset about something, you can't reach him because his emotions tell him that's what reality is. Well, I think we have a whole culture that's become that way. And it's gone over even into gender ideology, where people believe that if I feel that I am a woman, it doesn't matter what my biology is, it doesn't matter what my DNA says, I am a woman, and if you disagree, then you're a hater. Of course, it's inconsistently applied, but I think that if we stop and think about how can you talk to somebody who doesn't share your sense that doesn't share a common source of authority by which we can resolve our arguments, then everything eventually falls down into strong feeling. And I think this is where we're going, because our therapeutic culture trains us this way. We are trained to believe by our consumerist culture. This is not a liberal or conservative thing. This is about our consumer culture. We're trained to believe that if we desire something, desires are self-justifying. Right? And there's a wonderful man named Philip Reef who wrote a book called Triumph of the Therapeutic. Triumph of the Therapeutic. It came out in 1966. This book is prophetic. Philip Reef was a secular Jew, a sociologist, and a cultural critic. And in this book, he predicted the collapse of Christianity and the rise of the self-help culture and of the me generation. And he said it didn't start, he wrote it in the mid-60s. He said it didn't start yesterday. It started as far back as the 20s, as psychology became more and more prominent, and as people began to lose the idea that we could find ultimate truth, and ultimate truth existed, objective truth existed, they came to see therapy as anesthetizing us to the horror of believing, or the disorder of believing, that there's no such thing as ultimate truth. So in a sense, emotivism is not simply just doing what I want to do and allowing in a childish way, my feelings to dictate reality. It's a very sophisticated way of coping with the fear people have that there is no such thing as ultimate truth. But once somebody has given themselves over to emotion, it becomes impossible to argue with them. And if I can say very briefly, I think this is why Pope Benedict XVI was right when he said, the best arguments the church has for itself today are the art and the saints it produces. What he meant by that is beauty and goodness it made incarnate. Because if people today can't hear truth, can't hear a reasoned argument, because they say, well, why should I believe that? If they're unwilling to hear an argument based in rationality for the faith, they can at least not argue with beauty. It's like me and when I was 17 in the Chartres Cathedral, when I walked in there arrogant, thinking that God didn't exist, and suddenly, boom, I was hit by the awe of God's presence and the grandeur of this Gothic cathedral. I didn't walk out of there as a Christian, but I walked out of there knowing that God existed. I would not have listened to any argument for God's existence, but I knew when I was confronted with this great beauty and a medieval building consecrated to His glory, that He existed. And I walked out of there wanting to know more about Him. In a similar way, I don't think I know a single Christian who read him or herself into the faith completely. They first came to the faith usually by seeing saintliness, holiness in somebody else. That was also part of my own walk to Christ. It started in Chartres. I did read, yes, theology about it, but I also met the saintly Catholic priest, an elderly Monsignor, who had had a mystical experience as an atheist when he was an architect, 40 years old, and turned his life to Christ and ended up going into the priesthood. So, and I saw that man. He gave me his testimony in his little apartment, his little retirement apartment in Baton Rouge. I can see his face now as if he were right in front of me. And he started to cry as if everything that happened to him had happened the day before. the force of that man's holiness. And I would go spend time with him. I was writing a story about him for the newspaper, but I kept going back to see him and get to know him. And that gentle man, he never made an apologetic argument to me for the faith, but his very presence, the gentleness of him and the difference that Jesus made in his life, that was a strong apologetic. I think in an age of emotivism, we have to rely on art and the saints, on beauty and goodness to be doorways to the truth.
For about two more. Eric, do you have one over there?
Yes, I do.
Okay, then I have a final one back on this side.
Well, going back to your illustration of Dunkirk with our backs to the sea and so on like that, I thought there was one little detail that was missing, is that we're on the beach and we're all naked. That's right. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've stripped ourselves, for one thing, of our language, our Christian language. It's very often you'll go and you'll hear a sermon and it won't be using Christian language anymore. You don't hear good and evil. You don't hear about the soul. You don't hear about virginity, for example. You know, the beauty of virginity, like you were talking about, there's something that's beauty about that. So it seems like in modernism, also Christians have adopted a modern language that kind of pushes these off to the side, and then we kind of get a little bit embarrassed. Or strong words like fornication, words like that. We just don't hear that words that help us towards a moral direction in our life. Would you say something? I don't know if you're aware of the classical movement in education, because it seems like there's a way for us, there has to be a way for us to get back to having that mind where we can think with the kinds of language that we used to have among Christians that gave us the cultural shaping abilities that Christians of the past had.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because my chapter on education in the book is mostly about classical Christian education as a way forward. We educate our kids classically. My wife teaches in a classical Christian school, and very briefly, what the model, the classical model, not only introduces students to the great books, the great works of Western civilization, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, up through the patristic period and the medieval period to modern times. That's part of it. But more profoundly, it believes in the ancient view, the classical view of education as formation in virtue. It's not just putting information in your head, but it's forming your hearts, forming the hearts of the people there so they can choose the good. To be free in the classical view is to be at liberty to choose excellence, to choose virtue, and as Christians, to choose to follow Christ. One thing that's really interesting about this, to speak directly to your question, is how the poetry these kids study and is just, it gives them a whole different vocabulary, not just in words specifically, but different images and stories. I discovered the grandeur of classical education and the value of it. The first year my son Matthew was 12, and he started in a classical Christian school, and we read the Odyssey together. I never had the Odyssey. I went through public school in Louisiana. You know, we didn't have that. If I wanted it, I could have found it, but I never had it. Well, I was educated in it with him, and we went on that journey as a father and a son through the adventures of Odysseus, and it was phenomenal. It gave us ways, stories to which to talk about different virtues and what it meant to be faithful, what it meant to be obedient, just all kinds of things that are in the Odyssey. Same thing with Dante's Commedia, Divine Comedy, which I wrote a book about that, about how that changed my life and gave me a way to think about my life as somebody who was physically and spiritually and emotionally broken in the middle of my life when I returned to Louisiana, and I found out like family secrets came out that had been shielded from me for a while, and it broke me. And I didn't know how to get out of this dark wood I was in. Well, as my wife says, I was in a bookstore one day in Baton Rouge, and I saw the Divine Comedy in the poetry section. I don't know why I was in the poetry section. I pulled it off the shelf and said, I wish I'd read that, but it's too late for me now. Open it to the first lines. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the straight path. Boom, that's me. I knew that was me. And I said, this is a message in a bottle that's washed ashore for me. And I ended up buying the book, and I read it prayerfully, intensely, like a man trying to save his life. And God brought me out of that dark wood through that poem. And I ended up telling my wife later, I said, I couldn't, all the things that I've read in here about are things that I could have read in a book of nonfiction, the principles, and I wouldn't have understood them. But Dante gave me a visual vocabulary in which to allow them to enter into my heart, for me to wrestle with them in my heart and deal with them. And she said to me, you know why you were in the poetry section? I said, no idea. She said, you had read the Odyssey with Matthew, and you knew the power of poetry. That's why you were there. I think she was right about that. Anyway, I want to say before we leave that question, there's a great essay to read. It's called The Church as Culture by Robert Louis Wilken, W-I-L-K-E-N. You can find it online. It's in First Things Magazine from 2004. I drew on that. I quoted it in the lecture, and I drew on it for a lot of my Benedict Option analysis. Robert Wilken is a historian of the early church, and he talks about how the early church distinguished itself over the decades and first centuries of the church from the pagan Roman culture by the language it used. Not only the culture it created, but also the specific language it used, as you were saying, and how important that is, Wilken believes, for us today, the church today, to recover that. That's a great question. Last one?
One final, yeah, right, exactly, one final question.
All right, for the record, I want everybody to know, I don't remember you trying to get Mondale elected, okay?
I did. There were 5 of us.
You identified in your talk that one of the increasing dangers we're seeing is increases in tribalism. And I wanted you to clarify with the group that you're not really advocating tribalism. You're not advocating for balkanization. You're advocating for a more communal action, right?
Yeah,
right?
Thanks for that question, Calvin. And this is one of my classmates from high school. Yeah, it's a difficult thing, Calvin, because I look to Orthodox Jews. Our old friend from high school, Mark Kaplan, became an Orthodox Jew. He was a Reformed Jew, and went and studied in college. He converted to Orthodox Judaism, and they have really intense communities. And there are modern Orthodox Jews who aren't the black hats that you see on TV, but they live a really separate life in the sense that they do the things necessary to fulfill their religion, which means on the Sabbath they can't drive, for example, and they have to walk to synagogue. And yet the modern Orthodox Jews are embedded in the world. I look to them as an example. They're not hostile to people. They want to be part of the world, but they're going to put the service of their religion and the continuity of their religious culture and the service of God as they understand Him. They're going to put that first. I'm not the kind of guy who wants to be myself or to raise my kids to hate people who are not like them. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's Christian. I don't want to live in that kind of world. We live in a pluralistic society, and we have to face that. But that simply means we have to adjust ourselves in the way we live in order to hold on to what we know to be true, even as we live in a pluralistic society. And I think you're absolutely right, there's a tremendous danger of becoming so angry, especially when others who don't share our views are angry at us and move to oppress or marginalize or insult us. One thing as Christians we absolutely are not permitted to do is to hate. We cannot hate those who hate us. If you saw my inbox, you would know how hard this is for me to deal with. But it's absolutely true, because one thing that's been helpful to me as a political conservative and a religious conservative is I've spent most of my time in workplaces where nobody is like me. There are very few conservative Christians in New York City newsrooms or Washington, D.C. newsrooms, or even in Dallas, Texas newsrooms, believe it or not. And this has helped me in a way to be more sensitive to what it's like to be on the outside. And I have a frenemy relationship with Andrew Sullivan, the gay rights advocate. He's probably the most important person towards getting gay marriage accepted in America. And Andrew, when I became a Catholic in 1993 at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, Andrew was the first one to come up the aisle and welcome me into the Catholic Church. But he and I have had knockdown dragouts in public over gay rights and Catholicism and Christianity. But I can't hate the guy. And I don't think he can hate me, because at some point our basic humanity manages to unite us, even though we are at complete polar opposites. And I think that Andrew has, even though he and I frustrate each other to no end, I really do believe that we manage to keep each other's humanity at the forefront, and it helps us to stay friends even though we strongly disagree. And I think that's just a general an approach I want to live by, because I got to tell you, I feel so alienated right now from American politics. I'm a conservative, but what's happening right now on both sides, I don't recognize this country. And I wonder where the restraints are on both the left and the right, because it seems to me that extremism, that identity politics, believing that loving yourself means hating the other, that fever is taken over on both sides of the aisle. I don't know where it's going to go, but I know it's not taking me with it. I'll close on this. One of the readers of my blog was a high school kid in a Christian school, and wrote and said white nationalism was taking over his class at his Christian school. I said, wait, how is that possible? He said, because these guys are reading it on the internet, these middle-class Christian kids, and becoming excited by it. It seems daring and edgy, and they're becoming radicalized. And I told him, I said, go tell your headmaster, because this thing has to be headed off. This is not of Christ. But if the parents and the churches and the schools become ignorant or remain ignorant of what's happening and don't address it head on and talk about how this isn't of Christ, then we can't be surprised when we lose our own kids to stuff like this. So I don't have a complete answer for it, but yes, I'm not calling for tribalism. I think we can be distinctive and faithful to our own tradition without hating others. You know, I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative Christian, but I'm not angry about it, and I don't think you should be either. Thanks, everybody.
Just before you leave, if you'd like to hear more on this really important topic, I want to remind you all that Ken Myers will be here next Thursday. He'll be in the fellowship hall, which those of you who don't know perimeter, if you go up these stairs and turn that way and walk to Kennesaw, no, not quite, across from the sanctuary down there on your right, you'll find it, and that'll be a wonderful new chapter in this. Rod, thank you so much.
Thank you. Come here, Ken Myers. You won't regret it. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I escort you back?
Yeah, but short.
Where you get
let's
cost.
Yeah,
Since the time of the Apostle Paul, the name Areopagus has often been used in Christian history to represent the intersection of Christian faith and culture. In first century Athens, the Areopagus functioned as a philosophical forum for the exchange of ideas, and it was there that Paul first brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to Europe. Today, the Areopagus is an Atlanta-based Christian education ministry and study center that offers seminars, workshops, and forums on topics relevant to contemporary Christian life and ministry. The mission of the Areopagus is to equip and educate Christians to effectively engage our society with the life-transforming truth and love of Jesus Christ. To this end, we offer substantive courses along with workshops and topical forums that challenge Christians to live faithfully and consistently in accord with the principles and practices of a holistic biblical worldview. Founded in 2003 by Dr. Jeffrey Bashirs, the Areopagus sponsors dozens of events each year in venues throughout the metro Atlanta area. The Areopagus sponsors 3 regular programs in addition to other special events. The Areopagus Seminar Series features courses for Christians who want to broaden and deepen their understanding of the Christian faith and contemporary culture. These seminars are offered at a nominal cost and are taught by gifted instructors who are experts in their field, and include topics in biblical studies, Christian history, apologetics, contemporary cultural issues, contemplative spirituality, and literature and the arts. The Areopagus Forum Series features lectures, debates, and other presentations by outstanding Christian scholars, authors, and activists. Forums normally include a formal presentation and an extended question and answer session, and offer Christians a unique opportunity to interact with some of the great minds in contemporary Christianity.